We've all heard of the problems South Africa faces today. We are all also more than aware of apartheid, Nelson Mandela, and all of that jazz. That's about all people know about the situation in South Africa. Apartheid, a system of racial segregation, ended in 1994, and this video addresses the consequences of the end of this, the events leading up to apartheid, the crime and corruption in South Africa today, the near genocide in South Africa, and the need for a so-called Volksstaat. Now, this video is a wee bit different than my last three videos, in that it discusses something not everybody has a huge interest in. I'm aware of this, but looking at South Africa is very important for any racial realist, and problems there are widely ignored by the Western media. Without further ado, here is Apartheid in Retrospect. Now, this video, like my other videos, will be divided into three distinct sections, which are historical background and the implementation of apartheid, South Africa under apartheid, South Africa after apartheid, a possible white genocide, and the need for a Volksstaat. Lest my introduction is 2 minutes long, I'd like to discuss South Africa before apartheid. The land was explored and settled by Dutch people, now known as Afrikaners and Boers. The land was explored by these people in the 18th century. Later, in 1795, the British took control of the Cape region from the Dutch, or Afrikaners. Thousands of British and Dutch settlers came in the following century, and by the late 19th century, a war erupted between the British and Dutch. Now, at this point, the Dutch settlers had developed a language called Afrikaans, which is very similar to Dutch. On an unrelated note, it is probably the easiest language to learn if you are a native English speaker. The wars between the Brits and the Dutch settlers ended in 1902. We must remember that these lands, the lands settled by the British and Dutch, were not empty before their arrival. Bantu people, who are African, settled the area just a few centuries before the Dutch. Apartheid was later enacted in 1948 and sought to benefit not only the Afrikaner people, but the Anglo people as well, who are descendants of the British. Keep in mind that Afrikaner does not mean African, but it means descendants of Dutch settlers. Afrikaners are white. And it's kind of confusing because Afrikaner sounds a fair bit like African. Despite this system, only a small portion, about 1/5 of the country's population, was white, and this number has declined rapidly since apartheid. Now, this system of apartheid lasted until 1994, when elections were held that allowed blacks to vote. Nelson Mandela, an anti-racist icon, won these elections and instantly dismantled apartheid. But before we get to that, let's talk about apartheid. Under apartheid, blacks were not allowed to vote, and were segregated to some extent. And before I talk about some of the benefits of apartheid, I am not saying that I am justifying some of the more bad acts committed towards Africans in South Africa. Now, South Africa under apartheid did happen to be the most successful African nation at its time, even for blacks. In fact, the quality of life has declined dramatically since 1994. Violent crime has just exploded, as have rapes and inequality. The famously politically correct BBC traveled to South Africa and found the following quotes, all of which came from South Africans who are black. I quote, "Life here under apartheid was bad, but now it is more bad." End quote. And another quote, "We didn't really like apartheid, but many things were better under apartheid than they are now." End quote. According to many black South Africans, and especially for white South Africans, they believe that things simply worked under white minority rule. In fact, only 38% of black South Africans believe that the current government is more trustworthy than the apartheid government. Furthermore, 65% of South African whites claim to yearn for the days of apartheid. This is almost double the 39% recorded in 1995. Statistics show that education was much better under apartheid, and to some extent, so was healthcare. Crime, inequality, poverty, and the like were all lower under apartheid. Furthermore, blacks were given better jobs and had more economic opportunities under apartheid. This last piece is very important because of the Black Economic Empowerment Program, or B. I'll use the acronym B just for simplicity's sake. Now, B forces companies to hire blacks in positions of corporate power, management jobs, among other things. The government also makes sure that blacks are given higher priorities and acceptance rates than whites at universities, law firms, government jobs, etc. Frankly, B was an utter failure, and the fact that blacks had more social mobility under apartheid shocks many because of the sheer existence of B. The corruption, bureaucracy, and nepotism under the program is unreal. Now, the program has created an effective brain drain where hundreds of thousands of skilled whites have left the country. However, they're not just leaving because of a lack of economic opportunities. They're primarily leaving because of the crime and near genocide against white farmers in South Africa. Genocide Watch, an independent organization, has concluded the following information. I quote, "White people have been subjected to extremely brutal and racist murders. There are 50 murders per day in South Africa. 20 of the victims are white. This is a 95% or more black on white murder rate." End quote. Now, that rate is scary, especially considering the fact that 40% of the victims are white, despite the fact that only 9% of the population is white. Furthermore, whites commit so few crimes in the country, yet they're usually at the receiving end of crimes. So what's happening? Well, white farmers are being forced to leave the country in flocks. They're being killed like flies, quite frankly, but few media organizations dare to talk about this. The government of South Africa says 3,000 farmers have been killed. Thousands more raped and beaten as revenge. Now, keep in mind that this number does not include those who the government considers not victims of racial and revenge-based attacks. But white South Africans are being pretty truthful when they said that up to 68,000 white farmers have been killed or raped. Thankfully, there's hope for South Africa. A majority of South African whites wish for a Volksstaat to be created. Volksstaat means people state in Afrikaans. What is this? Well, it's a proposed independent state for white Afrikaners, and the town of Oranje in South Africa is an example of this. With only a few thousand people, Oranje is an all-white, all-Afrikaner, and totally self-sufficient town. This is their attempt at creating a Volksstaat. Now, this town has been quite successful despite receiving no money from the government or any other wealthy organization, and white South Africans experiencing with white South Africans experiencing a near genocide, a Volksstaat is definitely necessary. But I'm optimistic because the chances of a Volksstaat being created aren't as low as one might think. So what can we conclude about South Africa? Well, we can conclude that apartheid actually had a net positive effect for all of the races, but especially for the whites. We can also conclude that since apartheid, South Africa has become one of the most crime-ridden, impoverished, unequal rape capitals of the world. As a result, whites are being killed and leaving the country in flocks.